The first time Lieutenant James J. Farrell saw her, she was just another B-26 Marauder sitting on the tarmac at RAF Stansted in Essex, England, her aluminum skin gleaming dully under the perpetual gray of the English winter sky. It was November 1942, and the war was still young enough that men believed in their own invincibility, old enough that they had already begun to learn otherwise. The Martin B-26 had earned a reputation that preceded it into every airfield, every briefing room, every pilot's nightmare. They called it the Widowmaker, the flying prostitute, because it had no visible means of support, the Baltimore whore for reasons that varied depending on who was drinking and how much. Its wings were too short, its engines too powerful, its landing speed so high that one mistake, one moment of hesitation or miscalculation, would send you cartwheeling across the runway in a ball of fire and screaming metal. Farrell had watched 3 crews die in training. He had stood at attention at their funerals, had written letters home to mothers and wives he would never meet, had lain awake at night listening to the sound of his own breathing and wondering when his turn would come. The B-26 demanded precision at speeds that left no room for human error. You came in fast, you came in level, and if you didn't, the aircraft would stall, drop like a stone, and kill you before you had time to pray. But standing there that November morning, looking at this particular aircraft with its factory-fresh paint and unscratched canopy, Farrell made a decision that would define the rest of his war. He would name her after his family's scruffy little dog back home in Greenwich, Connecticut, a mutt that was always scratching, always covered in bites, always coming back for more. He would call her Flak Bait. He could not have known then what that name would come to mean, could not have imagined the legend that would grow around the single aircraft, the record she would set and hold for all of history, the 207 combat missions she would fly when most bombers were lucky to survive 25, the more than 1,000 holes that would puncture her skin, the countless times she would limp home on a single engine with hydraulics shot out and half her crew wounded, the miracle that despite everything, despite the mathematical impossibility of her survival, she would bring her men home alive again and again and again. But all of that was still ahead, hidden in the smoke and chaos of a war that stretched across a continent, waiting in the flak-filled skies over France and Belgium and Germany, in the frozen hell of the Ardennes, in the pre-dawn darkness of the longest day. That morning, she was just another bomber, and Farrell was just another pilot trying not to think about the odds. The early missions were an education in terror. The 449th Bombardment Squadron, part of the 322nd Bomb Group, flew low-level attacks against German installations in occupied France, railway marshalling yards, bridges, airfields, anything that might slow the Nazi war machine. They went in at treetop level, so low that Farrell could see the expressions on the faces of German soldiers as they scattered, so low that the aircraft shuddered from the concussion of their own bombs exploding beneath them. The flak came up in walls of black smoke and orange fire, 88mm shells timed to detonate at their altitude, filling the air with shrapnel that tore through aluminum like paper. The sound was indescribable, a metallic shrieking that drowned out the engines, a rattling percussion that made the entire aircraft shudder and buck. Farrell would grip the yoke until his knuckles turned white, fighting to keep Flak Bait level, fighting to keep her in formation, fighting against every instinct that screamed at him to break away, to dive, to flee. During those first weeks, he learned what it meant to be afraid. Real fear, the kind that lived in your stomach like a cold stone, that made your hands shake when you tried to light a cigarette after landing, that turned your dreams into a recurring nightmare of burning engines and disintegrating wings. He learned the smell of cordite and hydraulic fluid and burnt insulation. He learned how to fly with pieces of the aircraft missing, with oil streaming back across the windscreen, with warning lights flashing and crew members shouting damage reports over the intercom. He learned that the final 30 seconds of the bombing run were the longest 30 seconds of your life, that moment when you had to fly straight and level, no evasion, no banking or diving, just holding course while the bombardier lined up the target and every gun in the Reich tried to blow you out of the sky. But he also learned something else, something that grew slowly over those early missions like a secret understanding between man and machine. Flak Bait was different. She took the hits. God, how she took the hits, but she kept flying. Shrapnel would tear through her fuselage, punching holes the size of fists, and she would fly on. An engine would sputter and die, flames streaming back from the cowling, and she would fly on. Hydraulic lines would rupture, spraying fluid across the bomb bay, Control cables would part with a snap that you could feel through the yoke, and still she would fly on. It was as if the aircraft herself had decided to survive, as if some quality in her construction, some combination of rivets and aluminum and sheer stubborn will, refused to give up. The crew began to believe. Not in themselves, they knew they were just men, flesh and bone and fear, but in her. They would touch her fuselage for luck before missions, would speak to her in quiet voices when they thought no one was listening, would promise her things if she would just bring them home one more time. Farrell found himself doing the same, his hand on the throttles, speaking aloud as they climbed into formation. "Come on, girl. Just get us there and back. That's all I ask." And she always did. By the spring of 1944, Flak Bait had flown more missions than any other B-26 in the squadron. Her fuselage was a patchwork of repairs. Aluminum panels riveted over holes, metal scarred and battered but somehow still airworthy. The ground crews worked miracles, replacing damaged sections, splicing control cables, hammering out twisted metal and making her ready to fly again. They painted mission symbols on her nose, tiny bombs that marched in neat rows, accumulating into a testament of survival that other crews would stare at with a mixture of awe and disbelief. How was she still flying? How had she not gone down like so many others, spinning into the earth trailing smoke and flame? The invasion came on a morning wrapped in low clouds and driving rain. June 6, 1944, and the world was about to change. Farrell and his crew were awakened before dawn, stumbling into the briefing room to find it packed with men, the air thick with cigarette smoke and nervous energy. The briefing officer pulled back the curtain to reveal the map, and there it was, the coast of Normandy, marked with arrows and objectives and the terrible arithmetic of war. They would fly 3 missions that day, 3 separate sorties in less than 24 hours, bombing German positions behind the beaches, trying to give the men landing in the surf below some chance of survival. The first mission launched into darkness, the B-26 forming up by the light of their own navigation lights, a constellation of bombers climbing into the overcast. Below them, invisible in the pre-dawn murk, the greatest armada in history was crossing the channel, 5,000 ships carrying the weight of liberation and death. Flak Bait's engines thundered in the cold air, and Farrell could feel the aircraft heavy with bombs, sluggish and ponderous as they climbed. They crossed the channel in formation, tight and disciplined, and then they were over France and the flak came up like a solid wall. He had never seen anything like it. The Germans were firing everything they had, every gun, every battery, filling the sky with a density of fire that seemed impossible to penetrate. Bombers ahead of them were hit, staggering out of formation, some going down immediately in steep dives, others breaking apart in midair, wings folding, fuselages disintegrating. Farrell flew through the debris field, through the smoke and falling wreckage, and Flak Bait shuddered as shrapnel tore through her. He felt the impacts transmitted through the airframe, felt the aircraft buck and yaw, heard the crew shouting damage reports, but he held her steady, held her level for the bombing run, and when the bombardier called bombs away, the aircraft leaped upward, suddenly lighter, and Farrell threw her into a banking turn, diving for speed, fleeing the killing zone. They landed back at Stansted with holes you could put your fist through, with hydraulic fluid streaming from ruptured lines, with one engine running rough and smoking. The ground crew swarmed over her, counting the damage, shaking their heads in wonder. 2 hours later, patched and refueled and rearmed, they flew again. And then, impossibly, a third time as the day faded into dusk, dropping their bombs on German positions that were still firing at the beachheads below, still trying to throw the invasion back into the sea. When Farrell finally shut down the engines after that third mission, his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't unbuckle his harness. He sat in the cockpit in the gathering darkness, listening to the metal tick and ping as it cooled, and he realized that he had just lived through something that should have killed him 3 times over. They all had, and Flak Bait had brought them home every time. The missions continued through that summer and fall, an endless procession of targets. Bridges over the Seine, railway junctions, ammunition dumps, troop concentrations. The improved B-26 models were proving themselves now, the design modifications and intensive training paying off in survival rates that climbed steadily. But even among the survivors, Flak Bait stood apart. Her mission count climbed past 50, then 70, then 100, numbers that seemed impossible, that broke every statistical model. The law of averages said she should be dead, that no aircraft could absorb that much damage and keep flying, but the law of averages had never met an aircraft with this much heart. Farrell could feel her changing under his hands, becoming something more than the sum of her parts. Every patched hole, every repaired section, every replaced component added to her character, made her unique. She flew differently now, with little quirks and tendencies that he learned to anticipate. A slight pull to the left that required constant trim, a vibration in the right engine at certain power settings, the way she would drop her left wing just before stalling. He knew her better than he knew himself, knew her moods and temperament, knew what she could do and what she couldn't, knew when to push her and when to ease back. The other crews treated her with something approaching reverence. She was proof that survival was possible, that you could face the flak and the fighters and the fire and come home. Men would walk past her on the hardstand and reach out to touch her. A quick brush of fingertips against scarred metal, a silent prayer for their own missions. The ground crews competed for the privilege of working on her, took pride in keeping her flying despite the punishment she absorbed. Her maintenance logs read like a medical chart from a catastrophic accident: structural damage, hydraulic failure, engine damage, electrical damage, control surface damage. A litany of wounds that should have been fatal, but somehow never were. Winter came again, and with it a German offensive that caught the Allies by surprise. The Battle of the Bulge erupted in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, and suddenly the front lines were chaos. American units cut off and surrounded, German panzers driving deep into Allied territory. The weather was terrible. Low clouds, snow, fog so thick that flying was nearly impossible. But they flew anyway because men were dying on the ground and needed support, needed bombs dropped on German positions, needed the Luftwaffe kept at bay. Flak Bait flew through conditions that should have grounded her. Farrell navigating by instinct and luck through clouds so dense, he couldn't see his own wingtips. They would break out of the overcast over the target to find a landscape transformed by snow and violence. Villages burning, tank columns snaking through the forest, the whole frozen world below them locked in desperate combat. The flak was different in winter. The smoke from the bursts hung in the cold air longer, creating clouds of their own, and the shrapnel sparkled like ice crystals in the weak winter light. They took hits on every mission, limped home through weather that killed men in aircraft far less damaged than theirs, and somehow Flak Bait kept flying. There were moments during those winter missions when Farrell was certain they wouldn't make it. The time a fighter put a burst of cannon fire through the cockpit, missing him by inches, the plexiglass exploding inward in a shower of fragments. The time both engines were hit simultaneously and died within seconds of each other, and he had to restart them in a glide with the altimeter unwinding and the ground rushing up through the clouds. The time the entire tail section was so shot up that the aircraft barely responded to the controls, and he had to fly her home using throttles and trim, nursing her across the channel like a wounded bird barely able to stay aloft. But she always made it. Always. The crew stopped talking about odds or statistics or luck. This was beyond luck. This was something else, something that lived in the metal and rivets and stressed aluminum, something that refused to die. By the spring of 1945, as the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion, Flak Bait had become a legend. Her mission count stood at 207, nearly double the 25 required to complete a tour, an American record that would never be broken. Her fuselage was more patched than original metal, a crazy quilt of repairs that documented every mission, every close call, every moment when death had reached out and missed by inches. The historians would later count more than 1,000 separate flak and bullet holes, each one a story, each one a moment when mathematics and physics said she should fall from the sky, and each one a moment when she didn't. Farrell flew her on her final mission in April 1945, a routine bombing run that felt surreal in its normalcy after everything they had survived. The flak came up, they dropped their bombs, they flew home. He landed her for the last time with the gentleness of a man handling something precious and irreplaceable, the wheels touching down so smoothly that the crew barely felt it. When he shut down the engines, the sudden silence was overwhelming. He sat there for a long moment, his hand resting on the throttle quadrant, saying goodbye to an aircraft that had saved his life more times than he could count. The war in Europe ended a few weeks later, and the great machines of war began to fall silent. Most of the B-26s were scrapped, cut up for aluminum, their brief, violent lives ending in scrapyards far from the skies they had ruled. But Flak Bait was different. Someone, some planner or historian or dreamer, recognized that this aircraft represented something that needed to be preserved, a testament to courage and survival, and the thousand small miracles that allow men to endure the unendurable. She was disassembled carefully, reverently, each section marked and catalogued, and shipped home to America. Now she rests in the Stephen F. Udvarhazy Center of the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, her battered fuselage displayed for generations who will never know the sound of flak bursting around them, who will never feel the sick drop of the stomach as an engine fails over enemy territory, who will never understand what it meant to climb into that cockpit mission after mission knowing that the odds said this time you wouldn't come home. The patches are still visible on her skin, hundreds of them, each one a wound that healed. Museum visitors walk past her every day, some pausing to read the plaque that tells her story in dry historical prose, some reaching out to touch the scarred metal before guards politely ask them to step back. But the numbers don't capture it, can't capture it. 207 missions, 1,000 holes, 0 fatalities among her crew, just 1 wounded. These are facts, but they're not the truth. The truth is in the weight of fear that men carried into that cockpit, in the impossible choices made in fractions of seconds, in the sound of shrapnel tearing through aluminum and the smell of burning oil and the prayer that became a mantra. Just get us home, just one more time. The truth is that this aircraft, this collection of metal and rivets and human hope, beat the odds so completely and so often that her survival borders on the miraculous. She sits silent now in the museum's vast hangar, the engines that once roared across the skies of Europe forever stilled, the propellers motionless, the cockpit empty of the men who trusted her with their lives. But if you stand close enough, if you let your imagination fill in what the plaques and displays cannot convey, you can almost hear it, the thunder of engines at full power, the voice of a young pilot from Connecticut speaking to his aircraft as they climb into formation one more time, the sound of a war that was one mission, one aircraft, one act of defiance against death at a time. And you understand that Flak Bait didn't just survive the war. She helped win it, bomb by bomb, mission by mission, by bringing her crew home alive to fly again, by being the proof that even in humanity's darkest hour, courage and will and an inexplicable grace could triumph over the machinery of annihilation. She stands now as a monument not just to one aircraft's impossible endurance, but to all those who climbed into bombers and fighters and transports knowing the odds, accepting the fear, and flying anyway because the world needed them to, because freedom demanded it, because some battles must be fought regardless of the cost. And in her patched and battered skin, in every repaired hole and straightened panel, lives the memory of all those who went into the sky and did not return, all those who gave everything so that others might come home, all those whose courage purchased the peace that allows us now to stand in hushed museums and try, however inadequately, to understand what they endured and what they saved.